closer, breathe in the light. Morning hum in the garden high. Every wing has a story to tell. Every root knows how to heal. We listen, we learn, we gather and grow. Where the bees and the wild things know.
Hello, bee enthusiasts. Welcome to the Attic Bee Podcast. I'm your host, Jody Schramm. In this podcast, I talk a lot about bees and beekeeping, but we also explore the profound relationship between humans, nature, and all the pollinators that keep our world blooming. Today, we're diving into a question that might seem obvious at first, but holds some truly fascinating answers. The question is, why do we need nature? Not just for oxygen or food, but why does being in nature make us feel so good? Today's episode is about biophilia, a concept that suggests our love of nature isn't just a preference. It's actually hardwired into our DNA. We'll explore the science behind why a walk in the woods calms your nervous system, why we put plants in our homes, and why even looking at images of nature can lower your blood pressure. And as we'll discover, this ancient connection might be more important now than ever. So I'm going to start with a story. Imagine you're given a choice of 2 hotel rooms, both identical in every way. Same price, same amenities, same square footage, except one has a window overlooking a brick wall, and the other has a window overlooking a garden with trees, flowers, and maybe a little pond. Which one would you choose? If you're like most people, myself included, you'd pick the garden view without hesitation. But why? That's the question that fascinated the Harvard biologist Edward O. Wilson. In 1984, Wilson published a groundbreaking book called Biophilia, where he proposed that humans have an innate biological tendency to seek connections with nature and other forms of life. The word itself comes from Greek, bio meaning life, and philia meaning love. So literally, love of life. But Wilson wasn't being poetic. He argued that this wasn't simply a cultural preference or something we even learn. It was evolutionary. For the vast majority of human history, our ancestors lived in direct, constant contact with the natural world. Their survival depended on understanding plant cycles, animal behavior, weather patterns, and ecosystems. Those who were more attuned to nature, who found it engaging and rewarding to observe and interact with living systems, were much more likely to survive and pass on their genes. According to the biophilia hypothesis, we carry that legacy in our bodies today. Even though most of us live in climate-controlled buildings and order food through apps, our nervous systems are still calibrated for the natural world. We're like fish out of water, or more accurately, like savanna dwellers living in skyscrapers. Now, you might be thinking, yeah, that's a nice story, but is there actual evidence? And the answer is yes, quite a lot, actually. One of the most famous studies was conducted by a researcher named Robert Ulrich in 1984, the same year that Wilson's book came out, interestingly enough. Ulrich looked at hospital records of patients recovering from gallbladder surgery. He noticed that some patients had rooms with windows facing a small stand of deciduous trees, while others had windows facing a brick wall. Everything else about their care was identical. The results were striking. Patients with the tree view had shorter hospital stays, almost a full day shorter on average. They required less pain medication. Their nurses' notes described them as having fewer negative comments and more positive outlooks. Just being able to see trees through a window accelerated healing. This study has been replicated and expanded many times. Patients in rooms with nature views, or even just pictures of nature on the walls, consistently show better outcomes. Lower blood pressure, reduced anxiety, faster recovery times. There is something about nature that our bodies recognize and respond to at a fundamental level. But I want to get more specific. What exactly is happening in our brains and bodies when we experience nature? Well, when you walk into a forest or sit by a stream, several things happen simultaneously. First, your sensory system gets what researchers call soft fascination. Unlike the hard attention required by city environments, like dodging cars and reading signs and filtering out all the noise, nature captures your attention effortlessly. A bird's song, the pattern of light through leaves, the sound of water. These stimuli are engaging, but not demanding. They give your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for focused attention and decision-making, a chance to rest. This was documented beautifully by psychologists Rachel and Stephen Kaplan in their attention restoration theory, which was developed in the 1980s and refined over decades. They found that nature exposure helps restore what they called directed attention capacity, essentially your ability to concentrate and avoid mental fatigue. It's why a 20-minute walk in a park can make you feel mentally refreshed in a way that scrolling on your phone for 20 minutes absolutely does not. Second, nature activates your parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest mode that counteracts stress. Studies using heart rate variability monitors show that people in natural settings shift from sympathetic dominance, which is your fight or flight mode, to parasympathetic dominance within just minutes. Your heart rate slows, your breathing deepens, and stress hormones like cortisol drop. A study from Japan looked at Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing, which we've touched on in previous episodes. Researchers measured salivary cortisol, blood pressure, and heart rate in participants before and after spending time in forests versus urban environments. The forest groups showed significantly lower physiological stress markers. But here's where it gets fascinating. Even just looking at forest scenery on a computer screen produced measurable, though smaller, benefits. Getting out into the real thing makes a big difference, but if you have to cut corners, having nature photography around you has benefits too. So this brings us to something called biophilic design, the practice of incorporating nature and natural elements into built environments. And this is where the research is applied on a very practical level. Architects and designers have started taking biophilia seriously. They're adding living walls, indoor gardens, natural light, water features, and even just views of nature into offices, schools, and hospitals. And the results are measurable. A study of office workers in the Netherlands found that those with plants in their workspace reported 15% higher well-being scores and were 6% more productive than those without plants. Students in classrooms with views of green spaces showed improved concentration and test scores. Hospital rooms with access to gardens see patients request less pain medication. But it's not just adding a few potted plants and calling it a day. True biophilic design thinks about things like natural patterns and fractals, those repeating self-similar shapes you find throughout nature, like the branching of trees or the spiral of a shell. Research has shown that humans find fractal patterns inherently calming and beautiful. When designers incorporate these patterns into buildings and spaces, even subtly, people report feeling more comfortable and less stressed. Now, let's talk about what happens when we don't have access to nature, because the flip side of biophilia helps us understand just how essential this connection really is. There's a growing body of research on what some scientists call nature deficit disorder. Now, this isn't an official medical diagnosis, but it's a useful term coined by author Richard Louv to describe the human costs of disconnection from nature, especially in children. Kids who spend less time outdoors show higher rates of anxiety, depression, and attention disorders. They have lower vitamin D levels, higher rates of obesity, and less developed gross motor skills. And this isn't just correlation. Controlled studies where children are given regular nature exposure show improvements in all these areas. Adults aren't immune either. Urban residents who lack access to green spaces have higher rates of mental health disorders, cardiovascular disease, and even premature mortality. A fascinating long-term study from Denmark looked at satellite data of green space around children's homes and compared it to psychiatric health records years later. Children who grew up with the least green space had up to 55% higher risk of developing psychiatric disorders in adulthood, even after controlling for urbanization, socioeconomic factors, family history, and parental age. 55%. That's a staggering number. The researchers hypothesized that this connection works through multiple pathways: reduced stress exposure, more opportunities for physical activity and social interaction, better air quality, and here's the biophilia part, simply the psychological benefits of regular contact with living systems. So if biophilia is real and measurable, what are the implications? How should we think about nature connection in modern life? I think there are several important takeaways here. First, access to nature is not a luxury, it's a public health issue. Parks, urban forests, community gardens, these things aren't just nice to have, they're essential infrastructure for human well-being. Cities that prioritize green space aren't just more beautiful, they're healthier. Even in small doses, this matters. You don't need to live in a cabin in the woods to benefit from biophilia. A 15-minute walk in a neighborhood park, tending a few houseplants, even looking at nature photographs, all of these produce measurable benefits. It's about creating regular touch points with the living world. And this might be especially important for our relationship with pollinators and the natural world more broadly. Because here's the thing. We protect what we love, and we love what we know. If biophilia is real, if we're hardwired to find joy and meaning in nature, then disconnection from nature isn't just bad for our health, it might be bad for conservation too. Let me share one more study that really brings this full circle. Researchers in the UK looked at childhood experiences with nature and environmental attitudes in adulthood. They found that people who had frequent positive experiences in nature as children, so like playing in the woods, catching bugs, gardening with their parents, these kids were significantly more likely to engage in pro-environmental behaviors as adults. Not just say they care about the environment, but actually take action. They volunteered for conservation projects, donated to environmental causes, made lifestyle changes to reduce their impact. The researchers concluded that these early nature experiences created what they called an emotional affinity for the natural world. In other words, biophilia in action. When you have personal, positive relationships with nature, you develop what the writer Aldo Leopold called a land ethic, a sense of responsibility toward the more than human world. This matters enormously for pollinators. Most people support pollinator conservation in the abstract, but that support becomes action. Planting native gardens, avoiding pesticides, supporting policy changes when it's rooted in genuine connection. When you've watched a monarch butterfly emerge from its chrysalis, when you've observed a bee visiting your garden flowers, when you've seen a hummingbird moth hover at dusk, something shifts. It becomes personal. So here's my challenge for you this week. Notice your biophilia in action. Pay attention to where your eyes go when you're walking. Do they seek out the tree growing through the sidewalk, the clouds, a bird on a wire? Try to notice how you feel when you see something green and alive versus just the concrete and steel. And then lean into it. Take a different route that goes through a park. Sit outside for your morning coffee. Put a plant on your desk. Visit a botanical garden. Watch pollinators in action. These aren't indulgences. They're meeting a fundamental human need that evolution has given us. And here's the beautiful truth at the heart of biophilia. Our well-being and the well-being of the natural world are not in competition. They're deeply intertwined. When we create spaces and lives that include nature, we don't just help bees and butterflies and birds. We help ourselves. We become healthier, calmer, more creative, more connected versions of ourselves. Keep in mind, we're not separate from nature, just trying to visit it on weekends. We are nature, trying to remember ourselves. Thanks for joining me today. I felt like this was a little bit of a rant, but it's something I feel very passionately about. If you want to learn more about biophilia, I recommend Edward O. Wilson's original book, Biophilia, as well as Richard Louve's Last Child in the Woods, and Florence Williams's The Nature Fix, all of which explore these ideas in much greater depth. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to, share it with a friend, and touch base with me on social media. I'd love to hear from you. Until then, get outside, pay attention, and remember, your love of nature isn't random. It's part of who you are, what you're made of, and how we're designed.
As the day settles back into green, let the quiet stay with you. Tend the small things, rest and remember. The hive is humming too. Until we meet where the wild things grow, may